This is Paul McGUIRE, and you're listening to a prophetic emergency alert. The question that is being asked by so many people right now is, America and the world, what is happening next? In other words, what is going to happen next in our nation, America, and what is going to happen next throughout the world? And the reason the question is so intense and weighs so heavily on people's hearts is because for the last, almost 2 years, America and most of the Western nations and other nations have been through a period of unprecedented crisis, a crisis on a level we've never experienced before. Now, first and foremost, some of the disinformation that has been passed within the Christian culture and other cultures is something that you need to and I need to be aware of. The Bible says that our primary warfare, even in the coronavirus, is spiritual. So the Apostle Paul says in Ephesians chapter 6, "For our fight is not against flesh and blood," that means it's not against people, "but it's against the principalities, the powers, the dark unseen forces of wickedness in heavenly places." So what Paul is saying is that, yes, there is warfare and battles and conflict in the physical dimension between soldiers, between technologies, between weaponry that involves people, it involves nations, it involves geographic locations, and people die, and there's blood and bullets and so on and so forth. Obviously there was no bullets in the time of the Apostle Paul, but there were swords and there was other forms of weaponry that could easily spill blood. So the Apostle Paul is acknowledging the full reality of a full-blown military conflict on a minor scale or a major scale that involves real physical soldiers, real physical weapons, and real physical casualties and territory. He's acknowledging that. He's not super spiritual and flying over all this on the magic carpet ride. So that should be our position too, because if we're going to have a biblical worldview, which is what God wants us to develop, a biblical worldview requires that we analyze, perceive, gain knowledge, make decisions about our physical environment that's tangible and perceived by our senses, but that we do the evaluation and perception integrating a biblical worldview, which acknowledges that in addition to the nitty-gritty real physical conflicts in the real physical dimension, there exists a real conflict in the unseen world, the parallel universe, the spiritual dimension. There's a raging conflict, and the soldiers in this raging conflict, the spiritual realm, are largely unseen. They're fallen angels, they're demons, they're angels, there's God's power, there's Satan's power, so on and so forth. God really can't use people who are stuck in the Twilight Zone. They are not reliable and they're not credible. Let me give you another example of people who are stuck in the Twilight Zone, because this is an Achilles heel to the Christian culture. All the people that were taken in by QAnon were stuck in the Twilight Zone. There was no intellectual, knowledgeable, credible reason to believe the credibility or accuracy of QAnon. from the very beginning, when I didn't spend much time reading QAnon, but when I did read QAnon reports, or people sent them to me or whatever, excuse me, I'd glance over them, and the first thing that I recognized about the QAnon posts is that they encourage people to engage in what neuropsychiatrists and scientists and psychological warfare experts call, quote, magical thinking. That QAnon was promoting what is called magical thinking. It was promoting magical thinking. Now, those of you that watched the Paul McGUIRE report on video, the Prophetic Emergency Alert and the radio program, the Paul McGUIRE report, those of you that read my books know that I've written numerous books that deal in depth with the supernatural and scientific mind control, and deals with the methodologies and science of coercion, indoctrination, persuasion, brainwashing, advertising, hypnosis, and then just flat out mind control. In addition to that, I have researched and studied intensively what is known as Psyops, or psychological operations, or psychological warfare. In fact, one of the world's top experts, who's dead now, in Psyops, or psychological warfare, was a man named Colonel Michael Aquino. Colonel Michael Aquino was formerly the second in command of the Church of Satan under Anton LaVey. Michael Aquino had an infamous reputation that I won't get into right now. He also started his own offshoot of the Church of Satan. But Michael Aquino, even though he was an openly identified Satanist, he, on an intellectual level, he was a brilliant man. He was knowledgeable, he was well read, he had developed his intellectual abilities, he had studied and learned history and science and psychology and many disciplines. I'm not here to promote him, but that would be an accurate description of his credentials. So he gained as much knowledge as possible in very sophisticated fields. And he had read either one of my books, A Prophecy of the Future of America, or one of the articles that I've posted. He had read it because I dealt with talking about scientific mind control and Psyops, and he read it and he liked it and felt that I had an understanding of Psyops and mind control. So even though he was a Satanist, he contacted me and we communicated for on and off for a couple of years. Now, during that time, I learned that, and again, I am not in any way condoning or promoting some of his activities, alleged or real, okay? I find it deplorable. But having said that, he was an intellectual genius and had an exceptional knowledge of philosophy and science and so many disciplines. Therefore, he was promoted within, I believe, the NSA. He was the head of the NSA's psychological warfare division. And he wrote a number of books and articles on Psyops, or psychological warfare. And I remember in the beginning of one of his books on Psyops, called Mind Wars, he opened with a quote that the goal of Psyops is to so totally and thoroughly convince your enemy or opponent by using psychological operations. The goal is to so totally convince and make your opponent believe that there's absolutely nothing your opponent can do to successfully fight against you, to successfully win in a conflict against you. And Psyops is designed to embed in your opponent's consciousness the fixed belief that there's nothing you can do to win in the battle you're about to engage in. Your situation is totally hopeless, and the only thing that you should do and can do is to retreat and escape and hide as fast as you can. Thus, the purpose of Psyops is to win a war or a battle without firing a single shot. And that's a profound thought. And Christians need to be far more astute, far more sophisticated in their understanding, comprehension of these ongoing, up until the moment, psychological warfare strategies. Okay, so we discussed a number of things. We also discussed prehistory. And he complained to me that one of the things that bothered him about Christians is that they had no understanding of prehistory, which essentially means they have no understanding of history before so-called history began. And that implies that he believed in what you and I might call the ancient or legendary super civilizations, such as Atlantis and Thule and the ancient civilizations that existed, the technologies and sciences that existed before the official record of mankind and the official history of mankind began to be documented by both historians and the Bible. In other words, it was his belief that there was a lot of history, technology, and science that happened before the Bible really starts to open up history in Genesis. Now, that alone, if you don't add to it, is a plausible theory, because if you just take ancient Babylon at the Tower of Babel, you see an historical indication of technologies, sciences, access to supernatural powers that were so far beyond their time, they're still beyond our time. So if we look at ancient Babylon from the perspective of analyzing it as a super civilization, and we look at the Tower of Babel for what it really was, it was more than just an occult tower. It was more than just the fulfillment of the first New World Order. The Tower of Babylon and Babel or Babylon, comes from the word which means, or term, which means gate of the gods, or the gate of God. What is meant by that translation? Does that mean that the Tower of Babel and ancient Babylon is a gate, a stargate, or a portal that God walks through as he leaves his dimension beyond space and time and enters the physical dimension of our reality? Is that what it is? I don't think so, because God is all-powerful. God can create, God can be anywhere he wants to be, anytime he wants to be somewhere. God doesn't have to look around for a portal or a stargate. He just is there. So when God came down to ancient Babylon to check it out, he didn't have to go through a stargate. He didn't have to go through a portal. He was just there. He has the ability, I guess, for lack of better words, to conduct some kind of divine teleportation. Okay, so now having said that, we still have to deal with the definition of ancient Babylon, which means gate of God or gate of the gods. I think the more accurate translation would be gate of the gods, small g. And I believe that that translation, God, small g, gate of the gods, small g, refers to gods, small g. What were the gods, small g? Well, they were the fallen angels. They were demons. They were potentially other interdimensional creatures, but specifically fallen angels and demons. So, we have often asked the question, people have often asked the question, how did the Nephilim and Rephaim, how did these fallen angels move out of the dimension of the spiritual world where they were living? How did they move from the spiritual world into the physical material world of planet Earth that we live in? And one hypothesis that a lot of Bible scholars embrace, including myself, is that these fallen angels or demons or whatever you want to call them, gods, small g, they know how to locate and access portals or stargates. And portals or stargates are like doorways. They're like interdimensional doorways that allow interdimensional beings like fallen angels and demons to come out of one dimension, the spiritual world, and by going through a portal, the gate of the gods, they enter into the physical dimension that you and I live in, that's perceived with our physical senses. Now that sounds heavy, but you see, he was probing me. Aquino, the Satanist, the scientist, the top-ranking man at the NSA in psychological warfare, this guy knew classical literature. He knew philosophy. It's all in his book. And you know, when I was reading his book on psychological warfare called Mind Wars, I couldn't help have a sense of sadness in my heart. One that is reoccurring in my life as a Bible-believing Christian. And the sadness is this. This man who's a Satanist is raised to the highest levels of our government, the head of Psyops of the NSA. But not only that, he's an intellectual. He's extremely well-read, and not just in a narrow branch of learning. He understands science, philosophy, art, culture, spirituality, and many, many other disciplines. Okay? But the thing that I noticed from reading his book is that he had a robust intellect, he aggressively pursued knowledge, and he read books and studied like crazy. And I said to myself, how sad. How sad that the continuing thing that I see in the Christian culture is consistently, I see a total lacking among evangelical and born-again Christians and Christian leaders and Christian pastors and seminary professors and denominational heads and in Christians in general. I see a consistent lacking of people who acquire knowledge in many fields, people who aggressively pursue the gaining of knowledge and wisdom. I see a total lack of people who are passionate intellectuals. All intellectual means, don't get hung up on it. All it means is that you use your mind, that you think. Intellectual is just a fancy word that means you think about things deeply. But I don't see that in the Christian culture. And most markedly, I do not see a pervasive desire in the Christian culture to read, study, research, and read books and study in all kinds of fields, areas, and disciplines. Now, before you say something, let me simply say to you, remind you, that if you contrast this anti-intellectual, anti-reading, anti-knowledge culture that we call modern Christianity, if you contrast modern evangelical Christianity with the Christianity of the Pilgrims and Puritans who founded America, you will see that the Pilgrims and Puritans were the exact opposite of evangelical or modern Christians. They were aggressive intellectuals. They read books on all kinds of fields and disciplines like crazy. They read. And of course it was easier for them because they didn't have social media and electronic toys, TV, radio, etc., etc. But even if they did, they were reading and studying and inquiring and gaining knowledge through reading. But their knowledge base was not just the Bible, although that's the most important thing. Acquiring a biblical worldview through the studying of the Bible, the entire Bible, is the numero uno thing we should pursue. But they didn't stop there. They read, and studied and acquired knowledge and understanding in a whole spectrum of fields like science, biology, psychology, botany, medicine, government, law, philosophy, the history, ancient cultures, the study of super civilizations, economics, the history of warfare, the history of the world and Europe and ancient Egypt and so on and so forth. In other words, they had a vast spectrum of knowledge that they got from studying and reading books. Now, this coupled with their biblical worldview, this coupled with their prioritization of studying and learning the Old Testament through the New Testament, Genesis through Revelation, equip them with enormous intellectual and spiritual power. Let me say this again. Because the Pilgrims and Puritans were so aggressively pursuing reading and the studying of different fields and acquiring knowledge and education, because they did that passionately, it deposited in their culture and in their lives and in their churches and in Christianity as a whole in early America, it deposited an enormous spiritual power and intellectual power. To understand this is all important. Now, Aquino, a Satanist, somehow manages to acquire intellectual, and even if it's counterfeit, a spiritual power on a very, very high level. So in many respects, he has many things in common with the Pilgrims Puritans. In the key area of Satan versus God, he's dead wrong. So why is it important? Why in the book of Proverbs does God tell us that we need to pursue knowledge, pursue wisdom, pursue guidance aggressively, as if it was precious jewels? And we're told over and over again in the Bible that the man or woman of God must pursue knowledge and wisdom and understanding and guidance aggressively. And that means the aggressive studying of the Bible and studying other books of learning, which in a combined effect give you power. Why? Because Sir Francis Bacon, who in a sense was a Luciferian, he was the head of the Rosicrucian movement, which became the Illuminati. Sir Francis Bacon in the 1600s was the primary spiritual advisor to Queen Elizabeth. Sir Francis Bacon was an impeccable scientist and intellectual and chemist and philosopher and economist. Sir Francis Bacon was such a premier scientist and historian that he invented the scientific method. In fact, Sir Francis Bacon, because of his intellectual firepower, developed what would be called modern science. Yet at the same time, although he hid this largely from the public, the secret side of Sir Francis Bacon and Sir Francis D was that he was very high up in the occult. Sir Francis Bacon was in a sense the head of the Illuminati, called the Rosicrucians. Sir Francis Bacon communicated with fallen angels and spirit guides. Sir Francis Bacon was a practitioner of alchemical magic and sorcery. Sir Francis Bacon learned with Sir John Dee the Enochian angelic language in which he would communicate in depth with fallen angels, because the book of Enoch is taken up into heaven, and the Enochian or Enochian language is allegedly the verbal language, not speaking in tongues, the verbal language of the fallen angels. So he was verbally, because he was also a linguist, he was verbally communicating with the fallen angels. So he was a super scientist and a super occultist, and he blended the two. Now, that blending of the two disciplines, occultism, Luciferianism, and blending it with science, is something that the ancient super civilizations commonly practiced, and they practiced it especially in prehistory. So what we find from studying ancient Babylon, the Tower of Babel, the legendary Atlantis, and by the way, the globalist elite today believe in Atlantis. They read the writings of the Greek philosopher Plato, who believed in Atlantis. They read the writings of Sir Francis Bacon, who wrote books on Atlantis. And all these occultists, along with the globalist elite, believe Atlantis was real, and it was the ideal model for a scientific government or a technocratic elite. So Atlantis, according to Plato, was ruled by 10 scientific kings, or what were commonly known as 10 philosopher kings. Because of their superior intellectual and scientific and spiritual knowledge, they were the scientific elite assigned to rule the masses, to rule the society or super civilization of ancient Atlantis. So this idea of 10 philosopher kings, 10 or 12 priest kings, this idea of a scientific elite or an occult elite ruling the masses in a super civilization is something that occultists, scientists, and the global elite latch onto and have believed for thousands and thousands of years. So when we go fast forward into modern civilizations, we see that Sir Aldous Huxley, a member of the British occult elite and globalist elite, Sir Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World, is advocating a scientific dictatorship ruled by an elite through mind control to rule the masses. Where do you think Huxley got that idea? He got that idea, he borrowed it from the Greek philosopher Plato, who ripped it off from the island of Atlantis in the 10 philosopher kings. Huxley borrowed it from the ancient Egyptian empire and the pharaoh god kings. That system of a globalist elite, an occult elite, a scientific elite ruling the masses because of their genetic superiority and their knowledge superiority. You see, the elite, like Huxley, borrowed it. So his ideal vision for a scientific utopia on earth, heaven on earth, was to build a society that was ruled by a scientific dictatorship or a scientific elite that would rule this utopia and rule the masses.